Hi, everyone, and welcome to part two of this English lecture on COVID's futures. I hope that you have had a pleasant break. So let's get started now by talking about the second story that I set you for today, Tananarive Shopping Day. So, this story is much darker than Beckett's story, though it too imagines a society that has dealt with pandemic for a long time, and whose people have grown accustomed to it. I'll talk more about the differences between the two stories at the end of this lecture, since they share a number of ideas about what this accustomed quality looks like, but they do write them very differently. So Tananarive, if you don't know her, is a famous science fiction writer. So she's had a lot of practice thinking through what science fiction calls world building, a term for creating a secondary or alternate reality in a consistent, compelling way. World building is especially important to near future sci-fi, since you have to know enough about how our world actually works in order to extend it into the future. She's therefore an author I'd advise you to study closely when it comes to thinking through your own final projects. So there are two things that are especially astute in Du's story, Shopping Day. So number one is that race and class continue to matter even during a pandemic. Shopping Day is about a black family living in Atlanta. They don't have a lot of money, and they're living in a neighborhood that has experienced massive losses from the pandemic. Their race and class matter to how they experience that pandemic. They live in the U.S. South, a historical locus of racism, and in Atlanta, a city that, like many U.S. cities, Milwaukee included, has a history of redlining. And redlining is a term for when white city planners section neighborhoods to keep them segregated and force people of color, and especially black folks, into less well-kept neighborhoods. These neighborhoods, like Milwaukee's, the ones in Atlanta in Du's story, have fewer hospitals and grocery stores, and because of the U.S.'s pay gaps between white and black people, their inhabitants are often poorer, working jobs with longer hours at lower pay. Du knows this history well, and also knows that pandemics almost always exacerbate whatever inequalities already exist. So her character's experience is made worse by their race and class status. They are living in a poorer neighborhood that has bad food access. The mother in the story has to go a long way to get to the grocery store, and it's a dangerous trip. Moreover, their neighborhood has experienced a high death rate. The houses around them are depopulated. This matches what we've seen in many U.S. cities, like Milwaukee, where the areas with the highest pandemic death rate are poorer neighborhoods. And the populations with the highest death rate are people of color. Du, grimly but realistically, is considering the continuation of these trends. So this might seem like an obvious point, but if you think about a lot of pandemic literature, including zombie movies, they often gloss over the ways in which inequalities can persist during a pandemic. This is partially because many pandemic stories like to imagine a collapse of society that makes everyone equal. This is a myth that goes back to the idea of death the leveler, which is a term that is like medieval in its provenance. It's very old. And this idea is that because everyone dies, everyone is equally subject to death. And you can see this in the pandemic trope of ragged bands of survivors cobbled together from greatly varying races and classes, all having to work together. But while this is a common story in the kind of apocalypse genre of pandemic narrative, structures of power and privilege do not disappear during pandemics. This would be true even if civilized society did collapse during pandemics, which it won't with COVID. I.e., people with more money are going to have more access to resources and supplies, and people are not going to stop being racist, unfortunately. But it's even more true in the much more realistic scenario Du envisions, in which civilized society not only hasn't collapsed, but has adapted to the pandemic. And you should now be able to answer quiz question number 5. So, and my apologies that my face is occluding some of the slide here. I will put these, like that text into the lecture notes so you do have a copy of it. So for the final part of this lecture, I want to pull back and compare these two stories and think broadly about them and what they tell us about how fiction and reality are related. So to begin, just as a refresher, fiction helps us reimagine society. However, imagination does have limits, and those limits are often circumscribed by the societies writers are coming from. This is especially true in near-future science fiction, since near-future science fiction has to imagine a future developing in a reasonable way from whatever current society the writer is working with. The two societies these two stories are set in differ pretty drastically in ways that matter institutionally, and I would urge you to think about this through your political science lens. I'm going to run down a list of the differences and then talk generally about what they suggest. So difference number one, a cooperative economy versus a barter economy. In both stories, we see people forming community relationships beyond the government in order to get resources, like grocery and medications. But the nature of these relationships is wildly different. In Beckett's story, this takes the form of favors and communal shared responsibility. Carmy, our lead character, picks up medications, art supplies, and even some drugs for her neighbors on her grocery run, while her mother, a good cook, cooks soup for 5 families in the building where they all live. The government supports these communal efforts by giving her more, quote, errand stickers. In Du's story, on the other hand, this takes the form of competitive bartering, swapping, and mistrust. Aisha, the lead character, recounts that medicine and food are frequently bartered, not shared, while at the end of the story she's worried she was about to be kidnapped by her neighbors, who could use her for extra food stamps. The government here doesn't know or care about these arrangements. It forces people into camps. So the difference. In Beckett's version of the future, people have responded to the pandemic by creating a community of folks who trust and care for each other. In Du's, the community has been forced to distrust neighbors and see survival as inherently competitive, bartering, not sharing. Additionally, the approach to medicine differs greatly in both stories. In Beckett's story, medicine is accessible and available, and you just can walk to the pharmacy and get it. In Du's story, medicine is rare, expensive, and difficult to get, so much so that it's used as money. Okay, so the second big difference concerns the way that each story imagines the government's response to the pandemic. So another huge difference here is how each story imagines government generally. In both stories, we see that the government has radically shifted its behavior to adapt to the new pandemic. In Beckett's story, the government has imposed cyclic lockdowns that everyone has to abide by, as well as made infrastructure changes that mandate hand sanitizing stations in every building. These are policy and infrastructure changes that are annoying, but intended to prevent disease spread, and that, as I said earlier, most people pretty much accept as normal by this point. But in Du's story, these sorts of changes don't exist. The disease has been left to spread through the population, and the only action the government has taken is to enforce a curfew and to round up the sick and place them in camps. Du's note that, quote, everyone has lost someone, grimly confirms that in this society the death toll has been enormous. The government's only action is punitive. It punishes the sick, who overlap with the poor, and has given no one any social assistance, i.e. increased access to medicine or food. The difference here is stark. In Beckett's version of the future, the government has made changes to everyday life in an attempt to help prevent the spread of disease. In Du's version, the government doesn't help anyone, but does punish the sick for being sick and the poor for being poor. Additionally, the implied history of these two societies differs according to their government's response. In Beckett's story, the death rate seems under control, and we see immediate government and city reaction to even a single case of virus. For example, the ambulance we see takes a sick person out of their building. But in Du's story, we are told that many, many people have died and continue to die, and everyone, the government included, has just kind of accepted this massive death toll. So the kind of summary and upshot here. In Beckett's story, the government has made a lot of changes to adapt civic life to the pandemic, even if it's still really problematic and the disease is still dangerous. In Du's story, people are left to fend for themselves, except when they're being rounded up and put in camps. And you should now be able to answer quiz question number 6. So, to begin to wrap up this lecture, I want to talk a little bit about why I chose both of these stories. So initially, I chose these tales because they show you, and again, think of political science here, why our social assumptions about government matter. Imagination is powerful, but it is never fully free. We can use fiction to imagine the future, but our imaginations are shaped by where we came from. In this case, the way that these two authors have imagined a future with a pandemic that isn't quite COVID but resembles it a lot are deeply shaped by their nationalities. And I didn't actually realize this when I was choosing these stories. I just chose 2 stories that I thought would go together. But then as I was studying them and preparing this lecture, the differences between them became so stark that I had to end by commenting on them. And you can tell from the slide already what the national difference is. One of these stories is set in Atlanta and is by an American writer, while the other is set in Toronto and is by a Canadian writer. The social assumptions of these stories, how their societies shape what they imagine the future will look like, therefore seem quite different. And to spell out the key difference here in case it isn't already obvious, in the Canadian story, the pandemic future is difficult but survivable. Everyone lives in cyclic quarantine cycles and has to deal with violent anti-vaxxers, while our leading family, who are people of color, still fear police violence. Like, world is not rosy and perfect. But at the same time, Carmi's network of people in the building where she lives still care for each other and about each other, and that care is government-sponsored. The government in this story has taken measures to prevent the spread of the disease and to support people supporting each other. Due's story, the American story, is much closer to a straight-up dystopia, though it also doesn't quite fit that criteria, and in part that's because a lot of the really scary things about that story, like police violence against poor communities of color, aren't fiction but are already happening in the US. The leading family in the story, who are Black, run the risk of family breakup every time they go to get groceries. Their government has abandoned them, offering no assistance and no health policies beyond a curfew. Worse, the government is an active threat to them, rounding sick people up and putting them in camps. And those sick people, as the story implies, are, as they are today during COVID, disproportionately Black and poor. So remember at the beginning of the lecture, I said that future-oriented fiction can have many purposes. It can inspire, it can comfort, it can challenge, among other things. So I want to end by thinking about, respectively, what are the purposes of each of these stories? Well, to start with Due's story is probably closest to a challenge story. Its future isn't entirely hopeless, nor is it a dystopia. The family in the story is loving, and they do their best to protect one another. But their situation is grim, and it is a warning. Due doesn't want our COVID response to end up looking like this, and she's showing us this portrait in order to help us think differently, to avoid this future, and to imagine a better one. Beckett's story, on the other hand, is both a challenge and an inspiration. Its future looks a little rosier compared to Due's, but then again, maybe it doesn't to Canadians who are used to a government more invested in social assistance and might experience this story as extremely dystopic. But for American readers, at least, it seems like it is happier than Due's story. So there are still big problems in Beckett's story with this COVID future, including the persistence of untrustworthy police and increasingly violent anti-vaxxers. These could definitely be warnings. On the other hand, the supportive community of Carmi's building seems more like an inspiration, a picture of people helping each other. So, as with everything fiction, it is complicated. And you should now be able to answer quiz question number 7. So, to wrap up, all of the things that I've just been talking about are things to keep in mind when you are composing your own flash fiction piece for the final project. Future-oriented fiction is always written as a reflection on the present. Depictions of the future tell us about where we're going based on where we are and what we see around us. When you write your own piece, think about this. What sort of future are you imagining? And more importantly, what effect do you want that future to have on our present? In other words, when you write a piece of fiction about the future, what you're doing is saying something about how you see the present. How do you see our present, and what do you think that means for the future? Fiction is overall the province of the imagination, and imagination is one of the most powerful tools we have for changing the world. Imagination lets us come up with different futures or alternate presents. It helps us imagine the futures we want and don't want. Again, it is reality's reflection, but also its sandbox. It's where a culture test drives its own idea of itself and its ideas about where it wants to go next. So because this is the last time I'm talking to you alone, the thing that I would urge you to do as we continue to live through this pandemic is read or watch or listen to or play fiction. Write it if you like. Make sure that your imagination is working, and make sure that your imagination is always, if you can manage it, one step ahead of reality. Thanks so much, everybody. I hope you have a good discussion about this lecture on Friday. And again, I wanted to remind you of what I said at the opening of this lecture. If you are not in a good spot right now, please do reach out to your professors. We care about you, and we are here for you, and we really do mean that. Thank you all very much, and see you soon.